Number 1. Cordelius Anthony Martin. At around 10 p.m. on July 27, 2023, 35-year-old Cordelius Anthony Martin walked into the Stone Lake Marathon Mini-Mart in Cassopolis, Michigan. Dressed in black with a mask covering his face, he went behind the counter and threatened the store clerk with a box cutter. It looked like he had everything under control. What he didn't realize was that while he was focused on the clerk, he completely overlooked a customer standing nearby with a six-pack of beer. And within seconds, he would be the one desperately trying to survive. The target was the Stone Lake Marathon, a local gas station and convenience store operating on South Broadway Street in the small village of Cassopolis. It was approximately 10:07 p.m. on a warm Thursday night when Cordelius Martin stepped through the front doors to carry out the robbery. At that moment, the shop was largely empty, just the lone cashier behind the counter and a local resident making a quick late-night run for a six-pack of light beer. With the box cutter in hand, Martin wasted no time moving behind the counter and trapping the clerk near the register. With nowhere to go, the terrified clerk was forced to comply as Martin demanded all the money in the drawer. At that point, Martin was completely focused on the robbery. He seemed convinced that with the store quiet and nearly empty, he could take the money and get away with it. But Martin was so focused on the clerk that he completely failed to notice the customer standing just a few feet away near the checkout lane, still holding his six-pack of beer. Realizing the clerk was in immediate danger, the customer decided he wasn't going to just stand there and watch. With the six-pack still in one hand, he reached for his legally carried concealed handgun with the other. The customer later told police that he couldn't actually see what Martin was holding in his hand, but he could see the fear on the clerk's face, and from what was happening behind the counter, he believed the employee was in serious danger. Without putting down the beer, the customer drew his handgun and opened fire. He fired 3 shots at Martin in quick succession. As Martin dropped behind the counter, the customer moved to the side, repositioned himself, and fired 3 more rounds. Then, moments later, he fired a 7th and final shot. Several rounds struck Martin in the arm, back, and face, while another appeared to hit a liquor bottle behind the counter. Within seconds, the robbery had completely backfired. Martin, who moments earlier was threatening the clerk with a box cutter, was now lying seriously wounded on the floor. But the confrontation wasn't over yet. Despite being hit multiple times, Martin was still conscious and began crawling toward the customer. Unsure if he was still a threat, the customer backed away and ran outside to his vehicle for another loaded magazine. He then returned to the store and kept Martin at gunpoint until police arrived. Martin survived the shooting but suffered serious injuries. He was taken to a hospital in South Bend, Indiana, where he remained for nearly 3 weeks before being released on August 16th. The clerk, on the other hand, made it through the robbery without being seriously injured. When he later spoke to reporters about the customer who intervened, he said the man had saved his life. But even though Martin was committing an armed robbery, authorities still had to determine whether the customer was legally justified in shooting him 7 times. Investigators reviewed the surveillance footage and carefully examined what led up to the shooting. They also confirmed that the customer had a valid concealed pistol license and previous experience working as a security guard. Cass County prosecutor Victor Fitz explained that under Michigan law, a person can use force to protect someone else if they reasonably believe that person is in immediate danger of serious harm. After reviewing the surveillance footage and the circumstances of the shooting, prosecutors determined that the customer acted lawfully and would not face any criminal charges. Martin, however, wasn't nearly as fortunate. One day after leaving the hospital, on August 17th, he was arraigned on charges of armed robbery, assault with intent to rob while armed, and felonious assault. Martin already had 3 prior felony convictions, so prosecutors also charged him as a 4th-time habitual offender. His bond was set at $100,000. Martin was eventually sent to state prison, but that wasn't the last of his problems. In late 2024, he was convicted of a separate armed robbery at a gas station in Niles Township. Then, in January 2025, a judge handed him an additional sentence of 15 to 45 years in prison. Number 2, Tyrone Lee. It was around 6 p.m. on a Thursday evening when 36-year-old Tyrone Lee walked into Forest Acres Liquor in Tulsa, Oklahoma, carrying a loaded, sawed-off shotgun. He pointed the weapon at store owner Tina Ring and demanded money while her daughter Ashley stood nearby. After taking the cash, Lee headed straight for the exit. But instead of making his escape, he made the disastrous decision to turn around and go back inside. Little did he know that single decision would leave him fighting for his life, and by the time it was over, he would barely make it out alive. The incident happened at Forest Acres Liquor, a family-run liquor store near 12th Street and Memorial Drive in Tulsa. 53-year-old Tina Ring and her 30-year-old daughter, Ashley Lee, were working behind the counter on the evening of February 22, 2018. Lee wasn't a stranger to them. According to Tina, he was a regular customer who often came into the store. In fact, just one day earlier, Lee bought a bottle of liquor, but accidentally left it behind on the counter. Then, about an hour and 40 minutes before the robbery, he returned to the store, and Tina recognized him and gave the bottle back. But later that evening, Lee came back again. This time, Lee was dressed in black, with his face covered and carrying a loaded sawed-off shotgun. Lee pointed the shotgun at the women and demanded money. Tina complied, hoping to keep him calm as she pulled cash from the register and handed it over. Once Lee got the money, he headed toward the exit while Tina and Ashley crouched behind the counter for cover. But instead of leaving, Lee suddenly turned around and headed back toward the counter where the women were hiding. Realizing they were still in danger, Tina reached beneath the register and grabbed a handgun. As Lee moved toward them, Tina stood up and opened fire at close range. Lee was hit in the torso, but he kept coming. He lunged across the counter, grabbed Tina, and the two began struggling over her handgun. Seeing the robber wrestling over the gun with her mother, Ashley reached for the second concealed firearm under the counter and fired into Lee's back to try and stop him. Despite taking that shot to his back, Lee managed to overpower Tina, wrestling the handgun completely away from her. He then pistol-whipped Tina across the head with the stolen firearm, opening a severe scalp wound that would later require 7 staples. With her mother disarmed and bleeding on the floor, Ashley stepped in and squeezed off another round at point-blank range, bleeding heavily from gunshot wounds to his mouth, arm, back, and leg. Lee finally gave up the fight. He dropped the stolen handgun, stumbled out of the store and into the parking lot, then climbed into his vehicle and fled the scene. Ashley immediately called 911 from inside the store, requesting medical help for her mother and reporting the armed robbery. Tulsa police arrived shortly after 6 p.m., secured the store, and began collecting evidence from the scene. By then, Lee was already gone. But he wouldn't remain on the run for long. Not long after, a man suffering from multiple gunshot wounds arrived at a local hospital in critical condition. It was Tyrone Lee. Police soon arrived and placed him under guard while doctors treated his injuries. Lee survived the shooting. Once he recovered enough to speak, he said he was shot in the mouth, neck, arm, back, and leg. He admitted that robbing the store was a terrible decision, but claimed he found the loaded shotgun near a trash can weeks earlier and never intended to hurt anyone. But the surveillance footage told a very different story. It showed Lee entering the store armed, racking the shotgun, and using it to carry out the robbery. Federal prosecutors later confirmed that the shotgun was loaded and illegally modified. After recovering in the hospital, Lee was taken into custody and booked into the Tulsa County Jail. Police also began looking into whether he was connected to several other armed robberies in the area. The Forest Acres robbery eventually became a federal case. On January 4th, 2019, Lee pleaded guilty to all 4 charges against him without a plea agreement. Those charges included robbery, using and firing a gun during a violent crime, possessing an unregistered firearm, and illegally possessing a firearm as a convicted felon. 4 months later, on May 3rd, 2019, U.S. District Judge Gregory K. Frizzell sentenced Lee to 22 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release. Tina and Ashley both survived the ordeal, and authorities later praised the way they handled themselves during the terrifying encounter. Number 3. Emmanuel Ham. 27-year-old Emmanuel Ham walked into the M&M Food Mart in Darbydale, Ohio, looking for a quick payday. It was around 9:30 on a Thursday night in March 2017. Armed with a handgun, Ham stepped inside and made his way toward the counter. But as he approached, the clerk immediately sensed something wasn't right and quietly reached toward his back pocket. Ham thought he was about to pull off an easy robbery, but he had absolutely no idea he was about to hit a brick wall. The moment Ham pulled his gun and demanded money, the clerk was already one step ahead of him, and within seconds, Ham would be running out of the store with a bullet wound instead of the cash he came there to steal. The M&M Food Mart is a small food market and gas station in Darbydale, Ohio. The business had already been through its share of trouble. Store owner Aziz Ketab later said the place was robbed 3 times in the previous year, which led him to buy a gun so he and his employees could protect themselves, their customers, and the store. On the night of March 9th, 2017, one of Ketab's clerks was working behind the counter when Ham entered the store at around 9:30. The clerk's identity was never publicly released, but surveillance footage captured everything that happened next. Ham walked into the store with one hand tucked inside his pocket and made his way toward the counter. Almost immediately, something about him caught the clerk's attention. The clerk grew suspicious and began preparing himself before Ham even showed his weapon. As Ham approached the counter, surveillance footage showed the clerk quietly reaching behind himself and placing his hand on the handgun in his back pocket. That small head start would make all the difference. When Ham reached the counter, he pulled out his handgun and demanded money. But by then, the clerk was already prepared. The moment Ham pulled out his weapon, the clerk drew his own handgun and opened fire, striking Ham in the hand. Whatever plans Ham had for the robbery immediately fell apart. Surveillance footage showed him scrambling toward the exit and running from the store. Despite his injury, Ham managed to get away, while the clerk walked away from the encounter unharmed. The entire confrontation was over in a matter of seconds. When the clerk later spoke to reporters, he said the first thing that came to mind when he saw Ham's gun was his children. He had no idea what Ham might do once the weapon came out, so he reacted immediately. The clerk also made it clear that shooting someone wasn't something he took lightly. He had never been in a situation like that before, and later admitted that he felt bad about injuring Ham. But from his perspective, once Ham pulled the gun, he didn't believe he had another choice. Ham, meanwhile, was wounded but still managed to get away from the store. His escape, however, didn't last long. After fleeing the M&M Food Mart with a gunshot wound to his hand, Ham eventually showed up at a local hospital for treatment. His injury was not life-threatening, but showing up at the hospital also made it easy for authorities to track him down. Police arrested Ham shortly after he arrived, and the 27-year-old was charged with aggravated robbery. Back at the M&M Food Mart, the clerk returned to work despite everything that happened, and given the store's recent history of robberies, keeping a gun behind the counter proved to be a crucial decision. Ham walked into the store looking to take the money. Instead, he walked away empty-handed, with a gunshot wound to his hand and an aggravated robbery charge waiting for him. Number 4. Rasheed Belvin. At 2:47 in the morning, live security cameras captured a dark SUV backing into the lot of a quiet neighborhood liquor store in Norco, California. Inside the vehicle were 4 young men equipped with rifles, preparing to pull off an aggressive middle-of-the-night robbery. As 23-year-old Rasheed Belvin burst through the front entrance with his firearm leveled, he expected a helpless, terrified victim. But 80-year-old store owner Craig Cope was already one step ahead of him, and before the gunman could even finish his sentence, the robbery took a deadly turn none of them saw coming. In the hours leading up to the robbery, the 4 men were driving around in a stolen BMW with several firearms inside. Among them were an AR-style rifle, a pump-action shotgun, and a semi-automatic handgun. The group consisted of 23-year-old Rasheed Belvin, 22-year-old Justin Johnson, 26-year-old Jamar Williams, and 24-year-old Davon Broaddus. The 4 men eventually made their way to Norco, where they planned to rob Norco Market and Liquor, a small store on 6th Street. Shortly before 3 that morning, their stolen BMW pulled into the parking lot and backed into a space near the entrance. Wearing masks and gloves, the men armed themselves before approaching the store. What they didn't realize was that the man inside was already watching them. Craig Cope owned Norco Market and Liquor since 1976. Even at 80 years old, he still regularly worked behind the counter. That morning, he was alone inside, finishing paperwork after keeping the store open past its normal 2 a.m. closing time. When the BMW backed into the parking lot, Something about it immediately caught his attention. Cope turned to the store's live surveillance monitors and began watching the men outside. Instead of being caught off guard, he now had several crucial seconds to prepare. So while the four men armed themselves outside, Cope quietly reached for the 12-gauge pump-action shotgun he kept behind the counter. Moments later, the men approached the entrance, with Rasheed Belvin carrying the assault rifle. Belvin stepped inside and pointed the weapon directly at Cope, ready to make his demands. But before he could even get the words out, Cope raised his shotgun and fired a single shot. The blast struck Belvin in the arm. Within seconds, the entire robbery attempt fell apart. Belvin immediately turned and scrambled back toward the entrance. Exterior surveillance footage captured him running toward the BMW while screaming that Cope had shot his arm off. Belvin's arm wasn't severed, but the shotgun blast caused enough damage to send the entire crew running. The other men rushed back to the BMW, and within seconds, all four were speeding away from the store. Back inside the store, the 80-year-old Cope was physically unharmed, but shortly after the terrifying encounter, he suffered a serious heart attack. The four suspects, however, now faced another problem. Belvin needed medical attention. The group drove the wounded 23-year-old to Placentia Linda Hospital in Orange County, where Belvin went inside for treatment. But arriving at a hospital with a fresh gunshot wound quickly drew the attention of law enforcement. Police were alerted, and officers soon found the same BMW outside the hospital. Inside were Justin Johnson, Jamar Williams, and Davon Broadus. All three were taken into custody without incident. Belvin remained in the hospital receiving treatment for his injuries before he was eventually taken into custody as well. Investigators recovered the stolen BMW, along with the firearms used in the attempted robbery. Authorities later confirmed that 2 of those weapons were also reported stolen. Back in Norco, investigators reviewed the surveillance footage to determine whether Cope was legally justified in shooting Belvin. What they saw left little doubt. Authorities determined that Cope acted in self-defense. The Riverside County Sheriff's Department later praised his actions, saying a lawfully armed member of the community stopped a violent crime and protected himself in the process. Cope later explained that spotting the men outside before they entered gave him enough time to prepare, and despite how quickly he reacted, he wasn't a former police officer or military veteran. He was simply an 80-year-old store owner. He did, however, have experience with firearms dating back to his childhood, when he hunted small game. For the 4 men who targeted Cope's store, the consequences were only beginning. The Riverside County District Attorney's Office charged Rasheed Belvin, Justin Johnson, Jamar Williams, and Davon Broadus in connection with the attempted robbery. The charges included conspiracy and attempted robbery, along with additional offenses involving firearms, stolen property, and elder abuse. Initially, all 4 were held on $500,000 bail each. Johnson, Williams, and Broadus later pleaded guilty to charges connected to the case, and in September 2023, each was sentenced to approximately 3 years in custody. Belvin, however, faced a much more serious consequence. Belvin eventually pleaded guilty to multiple charges, including conspiracy to commit robbery, attempted robbery, assault with an assault weapon, elder abuse, carrying a loaded stolen firearm, and receiving stolen property. Then, in November 2023, Riverside County Superior Court Judge Gary Polk sentenced him to 10 years and 4 months in custody. For Craig Cope, the months after the attempted robbery were difficult. Shortly after the shooting, he suffered a heart attack but survived and eventually returned to work. Then, in October 2022, Cope suffered a severe stroke. He died 2 months later, on December 27, 2022, at the age of 80. Number 5. Eric Eugene Washington. 30-year-old Eric Eugene Washington walked into El Ranchito Taqueria in Houston, wearing a ski mask, gloves, and all-black clothing. Armed with what everyone inside believed was a real handgun, he began moving from table to table and taking the customers' money. Nobody fought back, and Washington appeared to have complete control. But while he was focused on collecting the cash, he completely overlooked a 46-year-old customer sitting nearby. Washington eventually walked right past him and turned his back. It would be the last mistake he ever made. In the days leading up to the robbery, Eric Eugene Washington was already living on borrowed time. He had a lengthy criminal record and previously served time for a 2015 aggravated robbery with a deadly weapon. He received a 15-year prison sentence but was released early on parole in 2021. Then, just weeks before the Taqueria robbery, Washington was arrested again for assaulting a family member. He was released on bond while still under parole supervision. Instead of laying low, Washington got his hands on an airsoft BB pistol designed to look like a real semi-automatic handgun and began targeting late-night businesses in southwest Houston. Then, at around 11:30 p.m. on Thursday, January 5, 2023, Washington arrived at El Ranchito Taqueria on Gessner Road, a neighborhood restaurant where several customers were still inside having a late dinner. He stepped inside wearing a dark hoodie and face mask, waving the replica pistol at customers seated throughout the restaurant. He shouted demands for money as terrified diners ducked beneath tables and handed over their cash and wallets, believing the gun pointed at them was real. Washington moved from table to table, collecting the money and stuffing it into his pockets. He seemed convinced that no one inside would dare fight back while he was holding them at gunpoint. What Washington didn't realize was that a 46-year-old customer sitting in a corner booth was quietly watching everything. Seated with his partner, the man kept his eyes on Washington and waited for an opportunity to act. After collecting the money, Washington turned his back on the dining area and started making his way toward the exit. Before Washington could reach the front door, the customer stood up, pulled a concealed handgun from his coat, and opened fire. Washington was hit several times and collapsed near the entrance, but the customer continued firing. By the time the shooting stopped, he had fired 9 rounds in total. The customer then walked up to Washington and took the weapon from him, only to discover that it was a plastic replica. Realizing the gun was fake, he angrily tossed it against the wall. He then recovered the stolen cash from Washington's pockets and went around the restaurant, returning the money to the customers Washington had just robbed. Once the money was returned, the customer walked out of the restaurant, got into his vehicle, and drove away before Houston police arrived. When homicide detectives arrived at the scene, they found Washington dead near the entrance and recovered the plastic BB gun, along with several spent shell casings. Police later released surveillance images of the customer in his pickup truck, asking for the public's help identifying him so they could speak with him about what happened. After seeing himself on the news, the 46-year-old customer contacted an attorney and voluntarily met with Houston homicide detectives on January 8, 2023. He gave detectives his account of what happened and explained that he feared for the lives of the people inside the restaurant. Afterward, he was allowed to leave without being arrested while the case was sent to a grand jury. The shooting sparked nationwide debate over whether the customer was legally justified in using deadly force. Nearly a year later, on January 3, 2024, a Harris County grand jury declined to indict him, meaning the customer would face no criminal charges for Washington's death. Number 6. Haniah Israel. 34-year-old Haniah Israel walked into Sam's Quick Market in Cincinnati, Ohio, shortly before closing time with a silver handgun and immediately pointed it at store owner Team Desta and his cousin. He demanded they open the register, and the two men complied, even throwing cash toward him as Desta repeatedly warned him to put the gun down. But Israel refused. With a gun in his hand and two men seemingly doing exactly what he demanded, he probably thought he had complete control of the store. He was dead wrong. Team wasn't about to stand there helpless while an armed robber threatened his life and his business. And while Israel focused on the cash, Team was already reaching for a lethal answer of his own. By the time Israel walked into Sam's Quick Market that Wednesday night, the store had already seen its fair share of robberies. The family-owned business, located in Cincinnati's South Fairmount neighborhood, was reportedly robbed twice before. After being targeted again and again, the owners decided enough was enough. They bought firearms and kept them inside the store, ready in case another robber came through the door. That decision would eventually pay off. Team Desta co-owned the store with his cousin. The two men moved to Cincinnati from South Africa several years earlier and were both working behind the counter on the night of September 20th, 2017. At around 9:26 p.m., surveillance cameras captured Israel walking through the door with a silver-colored handgun. He went straight toward the counter, pointed the weapon at the two men, and demanded money from the register. From the moment he stepped inside, Israel made it clear he was willing to use the gun to get what he wanted. Desta and his cousin immediately understood how serious the situation was. One of them began handing over the money, eventually throwing cash across the counter and onto the floor in front of Israel. At that point, Israel already had what he came for. But instead of taking the money and leaving, he kept the gun pointed at the two men behind the counter. Desta repeatedly told him to put the weapon down. Israel refused. Everything was happening within seconds, and about 3 seconds after the money was thrown to Israel, Desta decided he'd had enough. Desta pulled out his own handgun and fired a single shot, striking Israel and sending him to the floor. And just like that, the robbery was over. From the moment Israel walked through the door to the moment Desta shot him took only about 20 seconds. Desta and his cousin then walked out of the store and waited outside for police to arrive. Emergency crews rushed Israel to the University of Cincinnati Medical Center, but his injuries were too severe. He was later pronounced dead. For Desta, the shooting was not about protecting the money. He later said the cash in the register didn't matter to him. What mattered was surviving and protecting his cousin. Desta believed Israel was going to shoot them, and with the gun still pointed at them, he felt he had no choice but to fight back. Cincinnati homicide detectives later interviewed Desta and another witness about the shooting. After giving their statements, both men were released. The case was then sent to the Hamilton County Prosecutor's Office for review. 1 week later, on September 27th, Hamilton County Prosecutor Joe DeTers announced that Desta would face no charges, completely clearing him of any wrongdoing. He said the evidence showed the two clerks were clearly defending themselves. He was so confident in that conclusion that he declined to even present the case to a grand jury. As police looked deeper into Israel's background, they also began connecting him to a larger pattern of robberies in the area. Investigators suspected him of robbing Fairmount Carryout and carrying out 2 robberies at Abyssinia Food Mart. Local reports also said he previously robbed Sam's Quick Market itself. Israel also had a robbery conviction dating back to 2006, which landed him a 3-year prison sentence. Then, just a few months before the September 2017 robbery, he was arrested again for theft. But on this particular night, his luck ran out. Number 7. Michael Andrew. Michael Andrew entered Cam's Market in Bay Point with an armed accomplice and immediately went after the man behind the register. While his partner controlled another employee in the back, Andrew pulled a handgun on 56-year-old clerk Mark Kasperwitz, repeatedly pistol-whipped him, and knocked him to the floor before taking money from the register. Everything seemed to be going exactly as planned. But when the bloodied clerk climbed back to his feet, Andrew was about to find out that knocking him down wasn't enough to keep him there. It was right around 11 o'clock on Sunday night, December 22nd, 2019. At Cam's Market in Bay Point, California, 56-year-old Air Force veteran Mark Kasperwitz was getting ready to close up for the night alongside the store manager. Kasperwitz served in the military during the 1980s and later worked as a licensed private security guard. He took the store's closing routine seriously and always kept a close eye on what was happening around him. Without warning, 31-year-old Michael Andrew, who traveled more than 100 miles from Merced, California, stormed into the market with a second armed man. Both were masked, dressed in dark clothing, and ready to take control of the store. Andrew went straight for the front register in Kasperwitz. He jumped over the counter with a handgun in his hand and immediately attacked. Before Kasperwitz could do much to defend himself, Andrew began pistol whipping him across the head, striking the 56-year-old clerk multiple times and knocking him to the floor. The repeated blows split Kasperwitz's scalp open, sending blood pouring down his face and forcing him onto his knees behind the counter. Andrew clearly thought that beating the clerk into submission would make him helpless and give him complete control of the situation. He was about to find out just how wrong he was. With Kasperwitz bleeding on the floor beneath him, Andrew reached into the open register drawer, scooping up stacks of cash with one hand while keeping his gun pointed at the clerk with the other. During the chaotic physical struggle behind the counter, a firearm discharged, sending a round into the ceiling and sunglass rack area. But despite the beating and blood running down his face, Kasperwitz was unfazed. While Andrew was distracted grabbing cash from the register, Kasperwitz crouched behind the counter and reached into a hidden drawer for the store's handgun. Andrew was so focused on the money that he never saw what was coming. Kaspervitz got his arm free, raised the handgun, and fired a single shot, striking Andrew in the torso. Andrew immediately dropped the cash, jumped back over the counter, and ran for the front door. His accomplice abandoned the robbery as well, and both men took off into the night. But Andrew didn't make it far. He managed to run about half a block before collapsing on the pavement near the intersection of Lynbrook and Dasani Way. Deputies searched the surrounding streets and found Andrew lying unresponsive on the pavement. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Back at the market, paramedics treated Kaspervitz before taking him to a nearby hospital, where doctors used 12 staples to close the wounds across his scalp. The Contra Costa County Sheriff's Office later reviewed the surveillance footage, physical evidence, and witness statements. Investigators determined that Kaspervitz acted in self-defense, and he faced no charges for shooting Andrew. Number 8. Christopher Shockley. It was around 9 p.m. when 28-year-old Christopher Shockley entered a stop-and-go in Toledo and attempted to rob 29-year-old clerk December Long at gunpoint. During the confrontation, Shockley fired first, striking Long in the abdomen. At that point, he probably thought the robbery was as good as over. But despite being seriously wounded, Long wasn't finished, and within seconds, Shockley would be the one desperately needing medical attention. The incident happened on Saturday, November 2nd, 2013, at the stop-and-go located at 3131 Sylvania Avenue in West Toledo, Ohio. The same stop-and-go was robbed earlier that year, in February, so the people working there already knew just how quickly things could go wrong when someone walked through the door looking for money. That Saturday night, 29-year-old December Long was working behind the counter when, at around 9 p.m., Christopher Shockley walked into the store, armed with a handgun, and attempted to rob her. Shockley was no stranger to trouble. He previously spent time in prison, and at the time of the robbery, local reports listed his address as a halfway house in Toledo. But on this particular night, Shockley walked into the store armed and looking for money. What happened next took only seconds. During the robbery, Shockley opened fire, striking Long in the abdomen. For most people, being shot at close range would have ended any thought of fighting back. But Long wasn't done. Still conscious and seriously wounded, Long reached for the handgun kept behind the counter. Despite the bullet wound to her abdomen, she grabbed the weapon and fired back. One of her shots struck Shockley in the torso. Within seconds, the robbery turned into a gunfight, leaving both Shockley and the clerk he just shot seriously wounded. Police and emergency crews rushed to the store and found both of them suffering from gunshot wounds. They were taken to the hospital for emergency treatment. Long underwent surgery for the wound to her abdomen, and despite the seriousness of her injury, doctors expected her to survive. Shockley wasn't as fortunate. The single gunshot wound to his torso proved fatal, and the 28-year-old died from his injuries. Toledo police immediately began investigating exactly what happened inside the store, and one of the biggest questions was who fired first. Investigators determined that it was Shockley. Toledo Police Public Information Officer Joe Heffernan explained that Shockley entered the stop-and-go to commit an armed robbery before the situation turned into an exchange of gunfire. That detail made all the difference for Long. She didn't pull a gun on an unarmed robber or shoot someone simply running away with the money. Shockley shot her first. Based on the circumstances, police said they did not expect Long to face criminal charges for Shockley's death. Number 9. Jashar Hasslam. 26-year-old Jashar Hasslam entered Humble and Paidco with another masked robber, expecting to leave with whatever they could take from the store. Shortly after entering, Hasslam began wrestling with the clerk. Moments later, he pulled out a gun during the struggle and shot the man in the back. With the clerk wounded, Hasslam probably thought he had finally taken control, but the man he had just shot was about to turn the tables in a way he never saw coming. It was around 10:30 p.m. on Thursday, February 2nd, 2023, when Hasslam and another man approached the business, but almost immediately, their plans started falling apart. Hasslam quickly found himself wrestling with the clerk. Instead of backing off, he pulled out a gun during the struggle and shot him, but even a bullet wasn't enough to stop the clerk. Despite being shot, the clerk remained conscious and was still very much capable of fighting back, and Hasslam was about to find out something he hadn't expected when he entered the store. The man he had just shot was armed too. In fact, police later confirmed that the clerk had 2 legally registered firearms. Still suffering from the gunshot wound to his lower back, the clerk reached for his weapons and returned fire. Several rounds struck Hasslam, and within seconds, the entire robbery had completely fallen apart. The second masked robber apparently wanted no part of what was happening and took off during the struggle and exchange of gunfire, disappearing before police arrived. But Hasslam wasn't as lucky. After being struck several times, the 26-year-old was left critically wounded inside the business. East Hartford police officers responded to the scene and immediately began providing life-saving aid. Fire department personnel soon arrived and continued treating Hasslam before he was rushed by ambulance to a nearby hospital, but his injuries were too severe. Hasslam was pronounced dead at the hospital. The clerk, however, survived. He was treated at the scene before being taken to the hospital for the gunshot wound to his lower back. Despite being shot at close range, police said his injuries were not life-threatening. Investigators then began piecing together exactly what happened inside Humble and Paid Co., and the circumstances quickly became clear. East Hartford police determined that Hasslam and his accomplice entered wearing black ski masks and intended to commit a robbery. A struggle followed, and Hasslam pulled out a gun and shot the clerk in the lower back. Only after taking a bullet himself did the clerk pull his own weapon and fire back. Authorities continued investigating the shooting while searching for the second masked robber who fled during the gunfire. At the time, police said the man remained on the run, and there is no public record showing that he was ever identified or arrested in connection with the robbery. As for the clerk, he never faced any criminal charges for shooting Hasslam. East Hartford police determined that he acted in self-defense after being shot during the armed robbery. Number 10. Ryan J. Wages. 18-year-old Ryan Wages walked into a 7-Eleven near Frederick, Maryland, just before 4 in the morning with a bandana covering his face and a shotgun in his hands. He walked straight toward clerk Joseph Lehman, pointed the weapon directly at his face and demanded money. Wages probably expected the man behind the counter to immediately comply. But instead of reaching for the register, Lehman reached for the shotgun, and within seconds, Wages would be running out of the store without his gun or a single dollar. Joseph Lehman worked at the 7-Eleven for about 5 years, and according to the store owner, the business already saw its fair share of attempted robberies over the years. Lehman was working the overnight shift when Wages entered the store just before 4 a.m. He went straight to the register, pointed the weapon directly at Lehman, and demanded money. Instead of opening the register or handing over the money, Lehman reached across the counter and grabbed the barrel of the shotgun. The two immediately began wrestling for control of the weapon across the counter. Lehman initially thought he could simply rip the shotgun out of Wages' hands, but the robber held on much tighter than he expected. So Lehman pulled harder, and within seconds, he ripped the shotgun completely out of Wages' hands. Just like that, the robbery was over. Wages immediately turned and ran. He left the shotgun behind and escaped with nothing. Only after the confrontation ended did investigators discover something Lehman couldn't have known during the struggle. The shotgun wasn't loaded. But for Lehman, that changed nothing about what happened in those few seconds. As far as he knew, an armed robber walked into his workplace, pointed a shotgun directly at his face, and demanded money. Lehman later explained that he didn't have much time to think, but he wasn't completely unprepared either. His father and brother previously showed him techniques for disarming someone with a weapon, so when Wages pointed the shotgun at his face, Lehman remembered what they taught him and immediately put it into action. Wages initially managed to get away, but he didn't stay free for long. The following day, authorities received information that led investigators straight to 18-year-old Ryan J. Wages. Wages was arrested and charged in connection with the robbery attempt. But the story didn't end there. Once surveillance footage of Lehman wrestling the shotgun away from Wages began gaining widespread attention, the clerk suddenly found himself at the center of another controversy. The store's franchise owner initially said Lehman would lose his job. The reason was simple. 7-Eleven policy instructed employees not to fight back during robberies. By grabbing the shotgun and wrestling it away from Wages, Lehman did exactly what employees were told not to do. The announcement drew attention, but just 1 day later, store owner Abdul Ayub changed his mind. Lehman wasn't getting fired. In fact, the exact opposite happened. Ayub announced that Layman would keep his job, receive a raise, and be promoted to night manager. He later admitted that saying Layman would be fired was a mistake, explaining that he became frustrated by all the media attention surrounding the incident. So Wages' attempted robbery ended about as badly as it possibly could without anyone being seriously injured. Cases like these prove that having the upper hand doesn't always mean keeping it. These robbers walked in expecting easy victims, only to find out the people they targeted were willing to fight back. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next video.